Simplex method. This is one method that will turn a complex decision into a simple mathematics. Let us break down the simplest method for two variables. And trust me, by the end of this video, you will be able to solve related questions like a professional. Let's get started. All right, this is an example of linear programming, and we are asked to use simplest method to solve it. So we asked to maximize z, which is equal to 4x1 plus 6x2, subject to the following constraints. And it's 2x1 plus x2 less than or equals to 8, x1 plus 2x2 less than or equals 6. Then we are given this condition that x1 and x2 are greater than or equals to 0. Now, this is the first step you take when you are faced with a problem like this. The first thing you do is that these two constraints will be written in standard form. Also, the right hand side of z will be taken to the left hand side, and you have something like this. So look at this. This is the inequality form. So this part is talking about the standard form. So how do you convert to standard form? You introduce slack variable x1 and x2. Why did we introduce x1 and x2? We introduced s1 and s2 because we have two constraints here. So it depends on the number of constraints that you have. So if I have three constraints here, excluding this, so if I have three constraints here, then I'll be introducing three slacks variables. So now, since we have just two constraints and we are introducing variable s1 and s2, so to write this in standard form, we only add s1 to it and change the inequality sign to equality sign. The same thing for the second inequality. To standard form, add the second slack variable and change the inequality sign to equality sign. Then for z, instead of writing z equals 4x1 plus 6x2, then we bring the left hand side, the right hand side to meet z, and that gives us z minus 4x1 minus 6x2 all equals 0, and that's how we got this. Now with this, we need to create, with this information that we have, we can create the initial tableau. The initial tableau. This is what it looks like. This is the table here. And this table contains the basic variable x1, x2, s1, s2, and the right hand side. How did we generate this table? The coefficients of each variable on each row. What is the coefficient of x1 here? It's 2. The coefficient of x2 here is 1. The coefficient of s1 here is 1. Because this first equation does not have s2, then you put 0. The right hand side is 8. The same thing goes for s2. This row 2. This is our first row. This is our row 2. And this is our third row, row 3. Now, the row 2, the coefficient of x2 here is 1. The coefficient x1, sorry, the coefficient of x2 here is 2. The coefficient of s1, there is no s1 here, so it's 0. The coefficient of s2 here is 1. And the right hand side is 6. All right, so row 3, we have row z. You can call it row z or you call it row 3. The coefficient of x1 here is minus 4. The coefficient of x2 here is minus 6. Then there is no s1, there is no s2, and the right hand side is 0. So after creating your initial tableau, so the next thing you do is to identify your entering variable, and your leaving variable. How do you identify your entering variable? You need to calculate ratio. If you look at the previous table, we do not have ratio here, but this new table now has ratio. How did we generate ratio? Now this is what you do. You look at row Z, this row, look at this row. Look at the values there, the numbers there. Which one is the most negative number? The most negative number is -6, and that is why we highlighted this part. This arrow now is indicating the pivot column. So it means this column now is the pivot column. Now, having identified your pivot column, you need to calculate your ratio. How do you calculate your ratio? When you come here, what is the right hand side here? This is the right hand side column. So you say this value here, 8 divided by this. This 6 divided by this. And that's how we generate our ratio. Ratio is 8 divided by 1, which gives us 8. 6 divided by 2, which gives us 3. You do not really need to do for this. You can ignore. Then you generate something like this. After calculating your ratio, now you call this variable your leaving variable. Why this one becomes your entering variable? And this becomes your leaving variable. What does that imply? It implies that S2 will leave this place for X2. So now S2 will be replaced by S2 in the next table, that is in the next tableau. Now, there is an intersection here. There is an intersection between the row, the pivot row, and the pivot column, and that gives us 2, which makes the number here, this is the pivot cell, and the number in that pivot cell is known as our pivot element, which is 2. So now with this pivot element, you are going to create the row 2 for the next table. How do you do that? To create row 2 for the next tableau, you divide row 2. This is your row 2 now. This is our row 2. This is row 1. This is row 3. So you divide your row 2 by the pivot element, which is 2. And that's how we generated this. 1 divided by 2 gives you 1 over 2. 2 divided by 2 gives you 1. 0 divided by 2 gives you 0. 1 divided by 2 gives you 1 over 2. 6 divided by 2 gives you 3. So in our next table now, we are going to be having, don't forget I said this will be replaced by x2 since it is the living variable. So now let's see what the next table looks like. So to get the next table, you need to eliminate this to be 0 and this also to be 0. To do that, you need to generate a formula. Now, don't forget, this is our previous row 1, previous row 2, previous row 3. But we need a new table. Already, for the new table now, we already have a new row 2. Because this place will be replaced by this. Now, what about this and this? We need to also replace those ones. How do we generate those ones? Then you need to create a formula for that. How do you do that? Look at this. How did they generate this formula? To generate the new row 1 now and the new row 3, you use this formula. How did they get this? How did we get this formula? Or how did we arrive at this formula? R1 minus R2. Don't forget, the new row 1 now becomes R1 minus 1 times R2. Where did we get this one? From the previous one. We are using this pivot column to create the formula. So you say R1 is equal to R1 minus, if it is a positive number, you use minus the 1 year times the new R1, R2, sorry, the new R2. Then you go to R3 again to get the new R3 now. New R3 will be R3 plus, that is the whole R3 now, plus this 6. Why are we using 6 plus 6? Because it is a negative number. So that is plus 6 row 2. That's how we generate this. So if I'm to write this out properly, sorry, R3 here now is the new R3, which is equal to the old one, the old R3 plus 6 times the new R2. The same thing for this. This is the new R2 that we want to create now. And using this formula, we'll generate a new tableau, which is this. So let's try what I just explained now. Using this R1, we said that R1 is equal to R1 minus R2. What is the new R1 for this part? Don't forget, this is the R2 that we generated earlier. So R1 now is the old R1, which is 2. The old R1, which is 2, minus 1 times the new R2, which is 1 over 2. And this gives us 2 minus 1 over 2. And if you do the maths, you have 4 minus 1. And if you do the maths, you have 4 minus 1, which is 3 over 2. And that's how they got this. If we want to do for this as well, don't forget we are still dealing with row 1. You say the new row 1 now is equal to the old row 1. For this is 1. 1 minus 1 times the new row 2 now. The new row 2, which is equal to 1. So this gives you 1 minus 1. And that's how they got this 0. To get this now, you are going to use, don't forget, R1 now is still the same thing as the old row 1, which is equal to 1, minus 1 times the new row 2, which is equal to 0. And this gives us 1 minus 0, which is 1. And that's how they got this. You can pause the video and do for the remaining 2. Then let's move to row 3. To get the new row 3, this is the formula. So you say the new row 3 now is equal to the old row 3. What is the old row 3? Minus 4. Then you say minus 4 plus 6 times the new row 2. The new row 2 for this column is minus 1. And that gives us, the new row 2 for this column now is 1 over 2. So that will be 1 over 2. And this gives us minus 4 plus 3. And minus 4 plus 3 gives you minus 1. And that's how we arrive at this minus 1. Let's try this. Then I will allow you to do the remaining one yourself. So let's try, how did they get this 0? Row 3 equals, for this column, what is the old row 3? For the column 2, old row 3 is minus 6. Okay, that's cool. Minus 6 plus 6 times new row 2 now. The new row 2 is 1. So that gives us 0. So you can do the same thing for the remaining column. So now that you have this new table, there is something you need to check. Until we no longer have a negative sign on this row Z. If you are still having a negative number on this row Z, you have to continue with the next iteration. So you have to start the step all over again. So now we are going to do that. Since we still have a negative number on the row Z, so we'll pick our negative number to be our entry variable. So X will be our entry variable. And how did we generate this? You do the same thing, calculate the ratio, that is 5 divided by 3 over 2, which makes it 5 times 2 over 3, and you get 10 over 3. The same thing, 3 divided by 1 over 2 gives you 6. You now have the intersection of the pivot row and pivot column, which gives you the pivot cell, and you get your pivot element. So using the pivot element 3 over 2 to get, don't forget, this is our entry variable. So it means this is replacing x1. x1 is replacing s1. In this case, so we have a new s1. So now to create our new table, this is our s1. This is the s1 for the new table. So this is the new row 1. Don't forget the name of your rows. This is the new row 1 for the new table. So it is from this new row 1 that we generate formula. Now, how did we get this row 1? By dividing, you see, new row 1, divide row 1 by the pivot element, which is 3 over 2. So we use 3 over 2 to divide 3 over 2 to get 1. We use 0 to divide 3 over 2 to get 0. 1 divided by 3 over 2 gives you this. Minus 1 over 2 divided by 3 over 2 gives you this. And 5 divided by 3 over 2 gives you this. So now, let's go back. Let's come to the aspect of the formula generation. To get your new row 2 now, don't forget the logic. New row 2 is the same thing as row 2. Why are we using minus? Don't forget the pivot column. This is positive. That is why we are using minus here. Minus the 1 over 2 there times the pivot column. What's the pivot column? Row 1 times row 1. Then to get the new row 3, that's new row 3 is the same thing as the old row 3. Is it going to be plus or minus? Good, plus. Why? Because the number here is minus. So it's going to be plus 1 row 1. Why are we using row 1? Because row 1 is the pivot cell. So now you have the same formula, and when you bring the formula here, you see how they generated this and this. Don't forget our row 1 is generated earlier here using this logic by dividing the pivot element by 3 over 2, by dividing row 1 by the pivot element, which is 3 over 2. So now let's test and see if we are actually correct with the formula here. So to get the new row 2, let's do for this column. Let's do for this column. So it means the old row 2. What is my old row 2? That's 1 over 2 for that column. 1 over 2 minus the new row 2, minus 1 over 2 times the new row 1. The new row 1 is 1. So this will give you 0. And we have 0 here. Let me do for the next column. That is row 2 again now. Old row 2. Old row 2 for the second column is 1. So that's 1 minus 1 over 2 into my R1 now. That is new row 1. New row 1. That's 0 for this column. So this will be 0 and your result will be 1. And that's how they got this one. If you try it, you get for the remaining one. If you try the same logic, you get for row 3. You get this same thing. Now, how do you get your final answer? Look at Z. I said something earlier that until row Z has no negative element. And when you look at the entries or the elements of row Z, none of them is negative. So you can conclude that this will be your last iteration. So you don't need to move further. Then how do you identify the value of x1? The value of x1 now is equal to the value on the right hand side, which is 10 over 3. The value of x2 is equal to the value on the right hand side, which is equal to 4 over 3. And the value of z maximum now is 6 over 3, which is equal to the value on the right hand side. So if you find this video helpful, you can subscribe to this channel for more related videos like this. See you in my next video.